You know what a forest is, right? I mean, you probably know what a tree is. It's something that looks kind of like this, but bigger. And a forest is just where there's a lot of them. Believe it or not, that's how most governments define forests. You also probably know that there are different kinds of forests. There are jungles, there are temperate rainforests, there are dry oak savannas, there are mixed forests, there are pine forests, there's the boreal forest. But in this video, I want to get even more basic than that. I want to get us to a point where we can differentiate young forests and old forests. This video is going to be focused on those distinctions in Ontario because, as you might imagine, because there's so many different kinds of forests, it's different everywhere you go. Now, most of the forests in Ontario are going to slide into the young forest category. These are forests that are less than 200 years old, but most of them are quite a bit younger than that. So what are some things we can look at using just our eyes to figure out if we're looking at an old forest or a young forest? The first thing we want to look at is the variety of the kinds of trees and the varieties in the size of those trees. If you're in a forest and all the trees are the same kind and the same size, you're probably looking at a very young forest. If they're pine trees, they might even be a planted forest or a tree farm. Another easy way to tell if you're in a young forest in Ontario is if all the trees have white bark. These are going to be poplars, aspens, and birches. And these trees have important roles to play in old forests as well, but it is in a very unique role. These are what we call pioneer species. They're really good at taking advantage of a big open patch of sunlight and growing very fast to fill it. So if you're in a forest that's dominated by these white bark species, generally speaking, you're probably looking at the first generation of those trees, because once other trees have grown in, they have a very hard time competing in any sort of situation where they are shaded out by other trees. Now, these trees are very good at growing really fast, but on the flip side, they don't tend to live very long. Most of these white bark trees really only live about as long as a human does, from 50 to 90 years. Now, young forests aren't all going to be uniform. There's always going to be a bit of variety. There's going to be some older trees within those young forests. And it's actually those older trees that can tell you the most about what that landscape was before it was covered in trees. So old trees are really helpful to have because they tend to tell a story about the place they grew. So take this white pine behind me, for example. It's one of my favorite trees because it looks so weird. And a lot of old trees have features like that sort of can tell what kind of things it's been through in its life. And what these crazy branches tell me is that when this tree was growing up, it didn't have a lot of other trees that were competing for its light. Because conifers, like this white pine, tend to cut off those branches really fast if they find that they're competing for resources. And so just by looking at this tree, this big, weird tree, we can tell that all of these trees behind me and all of the trees on the same level as this white pine are probably a lot younger. So what we're looking at here is probably what used to be a pasture. Let me explain. Trees, as you already know, eat sunlight, as well as water and nutrients and all that stuff. However, because the sun is really the most important part of that equation, trees are going to grow in whichever way optimizes them to get the most sunlight. So I'm going to use these two not trees to illustrate my point. If a tree is growing with a lot of other trees that are about the same age or maybe a bit older, that tree is going to focus all its energy on growing exactly straight up. That way it can get its leaves to the top and it's not going to get shaded out by these other trees. However, if a tree is in an open field and it doesn't have any competition around it, it's going to do what this little guy does, and it's going to spread out as much as possible so they can get the most amount of light throughout their entire day. and it helps to keep other trees that might want to grow next to them from growing there. Okay, so those are the easy ways that you can identify and get some information about young forests. So what about old forests? How can we identify that we're in something that's more than 200 years old? Well, like I said earlier, all of the trees we've discussed so far do have roles in an old forest. There will be parts of an old forest that look more uniform. There will be parts of an old forest that have a lot of white bark trees. But there are some ways we can start to get clues that we're in a very old forest. And one of the best ways to start is to recognize what an old tree looks like. And every species is going to be a little unique in that regard. But I think we're going to start with the weirdest old trees in Ontario, the oldest trees in Ontario, these white cedars from the Niagara Escarpment. This is Lion's Head, home to Ontario's oldest known tree. A tree that has been growing here with its ancient siblings for almost 1,300 years. Growing horizontally out of a cliff comes with many challenges. It's hard to get water, it's hard to grow upwards towards the sun, you slip, parts of you have to regrow, you have to grab yourself into new handholds, and the winds and the winter can be quite harsh. But these trees are survivors, willing to take on the years of effort to produce these incredibly beautiful trees. Okay, so these white cedars take aging to the extreme. But basically all trees start to look weirder as they age, just like we do as humans. Bark gets warped and cracked in the same ways we develop scars, wrinkles, and frown lines and stretch marks. Moss and lichens cover old tree the same way hair starts to grow out of your face and nose and ears as you age. Old trees start to lean over, they lose a couple limbs, and even when they die, they leave behind signs that you won't see in a young forest. So beyond, scientists coming in and dating these trees, which, by the way, have been dated to about 250 years old, the oldest ones, how can we tell that it's an old growth forest? Well, humans tend to leave signs of their activity. And if you have a largely even-aged forest with a lot of stumps, then it's a pretty good indication that logging happened. But we don't leave stumps like this. This is a bit too big. But this was an absolutely massive tree at one point. And now it's so rotted to the point where I could probably push it over. But I don't want to do that. Because I also don't know what's living in there. Okay, there's a lot more to say about old forests, young forests, the role of forests, the complex relationships that exist within them. But I'm going to leave you here with the tools to start asking questions, to start making connections with what you see to the world around you. And I want you to keep learning about forests, but I want it to be coming from you, from what you're interested in. So go out there and find a forest and see what kind of questions you can come up with. I might have some answers for you when you come back.